Welcome to the channel. I know many of you listen to these videos to relax or fall asleep, and I'm really glad you're here. Before we start today's crime stories, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. And if there's any crime story you'd like me to narrate for you, feel free to request it in the comments section. Now let's begin. Story 1. Richard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935, in a poor neighborhood in Jersey City, New Jersey. He lived with his family in a small apartment. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, was an immigrant from Poland. He worked as a brakeman for a railroad company. His mother, Anna Kuklinski, was a first-generation Irish-American. She worked in a meat-packing plant and was a very strict Catholic. Richard was the second of 4 children. He had an older brother named Florian, a younger brother named Joseph, and a sister. Life at home was very hard and violent. Richard's father was a heavy drinker. When he was drunk, he would beat Richard and his brothers badly. He also beat his wife. Stanley would often leave the family for long periods, but when he came back, the beatings would start again. In 1941, something terrible happened. Richard's father beat his older brother, Florian, who was 7 years old, so severely that the boy died from his injuries. Richard's parents did not tell the truth to the doctors or the police. They lied and said Florian had fallen down a set of stairs and died from that accident. Richard was 6 years old at the time, and he learned from this that his family kept violent secrets. Richard's mother, Anna, was also very abusive. She would beat Richard with objects like broom handles. Sometimes she would hit him so hard that the wooden handle would break on his body. She was very religious and believed that harsh punishment was part of raising a child properly. Richard became an altar boy at the local Catholic church because his mother forced him to. Even though he served in the church, he did not feel close to God. He later said he hated his mother and saw her as a cruel person who ruined everything around her. As a child, Richard did not have many friends. He stayed away from other kids and spent a lot of time alone. He did not do well in school. He was big for his age, and he had a bad temper. He would get angry quickly, but he learned to control his anger in public. Inside, he felt rage. When Richard was a teenager, his father left the family for good. Richard had to help make money. He took odd jobs around the city. He also started getting into trouble. He stole things and got into fights. He did not get caught by the police for most of these things, but he was learning that violence and crime were ways to get what he wanted. As a young man, Richard got a job at a film lab in Manhattan. His job was to work with movie prints. He saw that he could make copies of popular films. He started making bootleg copies of Disney movies and selling them. Then he discovered that there was a bigger market for pornographic films. He began making copies of these adult movies and selling them for a lot of money. This was his first real criminal business. Through selling these illegal films, he met men connected to organized crime families in New York, like the Gambino family. Richard married a woman named Linda. They had 2 sons together, Richard Jr. and David. But the marriage did not last. While working at a trucking company, he met a secretary named Barbara Pedrusai. He divorced Linda and married Barbara in September 1961. Richard and Barbara went on to have 3 children together, 2 daughters named Merrick and Kristen, and a son named Dwayne. The family lived in a suburb called Dumont in New Jersey. To his wife and children, and to his neighbors, Richard seemed like a normal businessman. He told people he was a wholesale distributor. He wore regular clothes and went to work like any other father. He sometimes came home with large amounts of cash, but Barbara learned not to ask questions about it. If she asked too much, Richard would get angry and violent. At home, Richard had 2 very different sides to his personality. Barbara called them Good Richie and Bad Richie. Good Richie was a loving husband and father. When his daughter Merrick was born very sick, he stayed up night after night to care for her. He worked hard and provided for his family. He took them on vacations and seemed like a good father. But Bad Richie would appear without warning. During these times, he would explode in rage. He would smash furniture and break things in the house. He was physically abusive to Barbara. He broke her nose 3 times. Once, he tried to run her over with his car. He was so violent that he caused her to lose several pregnancies. He did not hit his children because Barbara told him she would kill him if he ever touched them. But he was still cruel to them. Once, he shot and killed his daughter's pet dog right in front of her as punishment for coming home late. Barbara once told Richard that she wanted to see other people. He did not yell. Instead, he quietly took a hunting knife and stabbed her in the back. The knife was so sharp that she did not feel it go in at first. He told her that she belonged to him and that if she ever tried to leave, he would kill her entire family. When she screamed at him in anger, he choked her until she passed out. Despite this violence, Richard continued his life outside the home. He was building his criminal activities. He led a group of people who committed burglaries. He sold stolen goods. He continued to sell pornographic tapes. He also started selling guns. His life was split into 2 parts: the quiet family man in Dumont and the violent criminal in the shadows. His family had no idea what he was really doing when he left the house. They only saw the man who came home. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Richard Kuklinski was deep into criminal activities. He was still selling pornographic tapes and stolen goods. He also sold guns. He met many different types of people through these businesses. Some of these people had large amounts of cash and wanted to buy things from him. Richard saw an opportunity. He could take their money and kill them, and no one would know. The first murder that was later linked to Richard happened on January 30th, 1980. The victim was a 42-year-old man named George Malaband. Malaband was involved in the porn business. He was going to meet Richard to buy some tapes. Malaband was carrying $27,000 in cash to pay for them. Richard met with him, and during the meeting, he shot Malaband 5 times and killed him. Richard then took the $27,000. He needed to get rid of the body. He put Malaband's body into a large 55-gallon drum. To make the body fit, he cut the tendons in Malaband's leg so it would bend into the drum. He then left the drum near a chemical plant in Jersey City. Malaband's body was found a week later, on February 5th, 1980. Malaband's brother told police that Malaband had gone to meet Richard Kuklinski and never came back. This was the first time Richard's name came up in connection with a murder. A little over a year later, on July 1st, 1981, Richard committed another murder. The victim was a 50-year-old man named Louis Mosquet. Mosquet wanted to buy a large number of blank video cassettes from Richard. These were valuable, and Mosquet had $95,000 in cash in his van to pay for them. He met Richard at a diner in New Jersey to make the deal. Richard shot Mosquet in the back of the head and killed him. He took the $95,000. But this time, Richard did something different with the body. He put Mosquet's corpse into a freezer. He kept it there for about 15 months. He did not want anyone to find the body right away. If the body was found much later, people might not connect it to him. In September 1983, he took the body out of the freezer. He did not wait for it to thaw. He wrapped it in plastic garbage bags and drove to a park near Clausland Mountain Road in Orangetown, New York. He dumped the body there. The body was still partially frozen inside the bags. On a warm September day, a person found the body. When the medical examiner looked at the body, he found ice crystals inside it. This was very strange because the weather was warm. The medical examiner realized the body had been frozen for a long time and then dumped. This trick later caused investigators to give Richard the nickname, the Iceman. On April 29, 1982, Richard killed again. The victim was a 51-year-old pharmacist named Paul Hoffman. Hoffman ran a pharmacy. He wanted to make a large profit by buying stolen prescription drugs cheap and selling them in his store. He had heard that Richard could get drugs like Tagamet, a medicine for ulcers. Hoffman had $25,000 and was eager to make a deal. He kept asking Richard to sell him the drugs. Richard agreed to meet him. He lured Hoffman to a rented garage. He planned to shoot him, but when he pulled out his gun, it jammed and would not fire. So Richard picked up a tire iron and beat Hoffman to death with it. He then stuffed Hoffman's body into another 55-gallon drum. He left the drum outside a motel in Little Ferry, New Jersey. A few days later, Richard drove by the motel and saw that the drum was gone. He never found out what happened to it. Paul Hoffman's body was never found. By the end of 1982, Richard's burglary gang was being watched by the police. One of his gang members, a man named Percy House, was arrested in December. House decided to cooperate with the police. He became an informant and was put into protective custody. The police also had warrants out for two other gang members, a 37-year-old man named Gary Smith and a man named Daniel Deppner. Richard was worried. He knew that Smith was thinking about leaving the criminal life and going straight. Richard was afraid that Smith might also become an informant and tell the police everything. He decided Smith had to be killed. Richard and Daniel Deppner, along with Barbara Deppner, who was Daniel's wife, planned to kill Smith. Richard rented a room for Smith and Deppner at the York Motel in North Bergen, New Jersey. He told them to stay there and lie low. One day, Richard brought food. He gave Gary Smith a hamburger. He had laced the hamburger with cyanide poison. Smith ate it and became sick, but the poison was slow to kill him. While Smith was weak and dying, Daniel Deppner took a lamp cord and strangled him to make sure he was dead. Barbara Deppner was supposed to come back with a car to move the body, but she did not return. Richard and Daniel did not know what to do. They hid Smith's body between the mattress and the box spring of the bed in the motel room. Then they left. Over the next 4 days, different people rented the room. They noticed a bad smell, but did not look under the mattress. Finally, on December 27, 1982, the motel manager got many complaints about the smell. He went into the room and found the rotting body. The police were called. They now had a body connected to Richard's circle. After Smith was killed, Richard needed to deal with Daniel Deppner. Daniel knew too much. He had helped kill Smith. He could become a problem. Richard decided Daniel had to die too. Around February or May of 1983, Richard killed Daniel Deppner. He lured him to an apartment in Bergenfield, New Jersey. The apartment belonged to his daughter Merrick's fiancé, who was away at the time. Richard had keys to the place. He probably poisoned Daniel first, maybe with cyanide, because when Daniel was later found, there were no signs of a fight. Then he strangled him to make sure he was dead. The murder made a mess. There was blood on the carpet. Richard asked his daughter's fiancé to help him get rid of the body. He told the young man that his friend was in trouble with the law and someone had killed him. He said it was best to dump the body so they would not have problems with the police. They wrapped Daniel's body in green garbage bags. On May 14, 1983, a bicyclist riding on Clinton Road in West Milford, New Jersey, saw the body in a wooded area. Vultures were circling around it. The police found the body, but they could not say exactly how Daniel died. They saw pink spots on his skin, which can be a sign of cyanide poisoning. They also saw that he had been strangled. They found that his stomach was full of undigested food, including beans that were burned. This meant he had eaten a home-cooked meal just before he died. No restaurant would serve burned beans. This clue told them he was probably killed in a home or apartment. Richard was also involved in other violent acts. On August 10, 1984, a man named Robert Pronge was found shot to death in his ice cream truck in North Bergen, New Jersey. Pronge had been a mentor to Richard. He had taught Richard how to use cyanide and other ways to kill. He was also the one who told Richard to freeze Louis Masquet's body. But Richard later said he killed Prange because Prange threatened his family. The police suspected Richard, but they did not have enough proof to charge him at that time. Throughout these years, Richard continued his pattern. He would meet men who had money and wanted to do business with him. He would kill them and take their cash. He killed his own associates to stop them from talking to the police. He used guns, poison, and beatings. He hid bodies in drums in the woods or froze them to confuse investigators. His family in Dumont, New Jersey, still did not know what he was doing. They only knew that he went out for business and came home. But the police were starting to notice a pattern. 5 men had gone missing or been found dead, and Richard Kuklinski was the last person seen with each of them. By the mid-1980s, the police had noticed a pattern. 5 men had either disappeared or been found dead, and Richard Kuklinski was the last person seen with each of them. The victims were George Maliband, Louis Masquet, Paul Hoffman, Gary Smith, and Daniel Deppner. A police officer named Pat Kane from the New Jersey State Police had been building a file on Kuklinski for some time. He had informants who told him about Kuklinski's burglary gang. Now, with multiple unsolved homicides pointing toward the same man, the police decided to take serious action. A special task force was created. It was called Operation Iceman. The team included the New Jersey Attorney General's office and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is often called the ATF. The ATF got involved because Kuklinski was also selling guns illegally. The goal was simple: find enough evidence to arrest Richard Kuklinski and convict him for murder. The task force needed to get close to Kuklinski. They decided to send in an undercover agent. The agent they chose was an ATF specialist named Dominic Polifrone. Polifrone was trained to work undercover with dangerous criminals. The plan was for Polifrone to pretend to be a criminal from the mafia. They needed someone to introduce Polifrone to Kuklinski. They found a man named Phil Salamine. Salamine was a close friend of Kuklinski. He agreed to help the police. For about 18 months, from 1985 into 1986, Polifrone worked undercover, pretending to be a mob-connected crook named Dominic Provenzano. Salamine introduced Dominic to Kuklinski. Polifrone acted like he was a tough guy from organized crime. He told Kuklinski he was interested in doing business. Over time, they met many times. Polifrone bought a handgun with a silencer from Kuklinski. This was a federal crime, and it helped build a case. But the police needed more. They needed Kuklinski to talk about the murders. Polifrone wore a hidden recording device during their meetings. Kuklinski did not know he was being recorded. During these conversations, Kuklinski began to brag. He talked about killing people. He mentioned that he had kept a dead body in a freezer for 2.5 years. He told Polifrone that he liked using poison to kill people. He said, "Why be messy? You do it nice and calm." He asked Polifrone if he could get him pure cyanide. Kuklinski also talked about killing a man by putting cyanide on his hamburger. The police listening to these recordings knew he was talking about Gary Smith. Kuklinski also talked about his plans to kill 2 people who were cooperating with the police. He called them a couple of rats. He meant Barbara Deppner and Percy House, his former associates who were now witnesses against him. Polifrone pretended to go along with these plans. He told Kuklinski he wanted to hire him to kill a wealthy drug dealer. This was a trap. The drug dealer was actually another undercover police officer. Polifrone wanted to catch Kuklinski in the act of planning a murder. On December 17, 1986, Polifrone met with Kuklinski. He gave him what looked like cyanide poison. It was actually a fake substance. They discussed the plan to kill the fake drug dealer. The whole conversation was recorded. After the meeting, Kuklinski left. He was suspicious. He took the fake poison and tested it on a stray dog. He mixed it with a hamburger and fed it to the dog. The dog did not die. Kuklinski realized he had been set up. He decided not to go through with the planned murder and started driving home. The police were watching him. They knew he was heading home. They set up a roadblock on the highway. About 2 hours after the meeting with Polifrone, Kuklinski's car approached the roadblock. The police stopped him and arrested him. His wife, Barbara, was in the car with him. The police found a gun in the vehicle. Barbara was charged with possessing the gun, since she was a passenger. Kuklinski was taken into custody. The 18-month undercover operation was over. After the arrest, the police held a press conference. They told the public that Kuklinski was charged with 5 murders. They said his motive was profit. He would set up business meetings with men, kill them, and take their money. Kuklinski told reporters that the charges were wrong and that the police watched too many movies. But the police had strong evidence. They had the recordings from Polifrone. They had witnesses. The trial began. Kuklinski's former associates testified against him. Percy House, the informant, took the stand. Barbara Deppner also testified. She told the court about how Gary Smith was killed with the poisoned hamburger and the lamp cord. Dominic Polifrone testified about his undercover work and played the recordings for the jury. The jury heard Kuklinski's own voice talking about killing people and using poison. In March 1988, the jury reached a verdict. They found Richard Kuklinski guilty of murdering Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner. However, they decided that the way the murders were done meant he would not face the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to a minimum of 60 years in prison. This meant he would be in prison for a very long time. After the trial, prosecutors made a deal with Kuklinski. They had strong evidence that he also killed Louis Mosquet and George Maliband. They wanted to close those cases. Kuklinski agreed to plead guilty to those 2 murders. In exchange, prosecutors dropped some lesser charges against his wife and son. Kuklinski was sentenced to 2 additional life sentences. These would be served one after the other, on top of his 60-year sentence. He also confessed to killing Paul Hoffman, but prosecutors decided not to hold another trial. It would not change his sentence because he was already going to be in prison for life. Kuklinski would not be eligible for parole until the year 2046. He would be 111 years old by then. He was sent to Trenton State Prison in New Jersey to serve his time. While in prison, Kuklinski started talking to many people. He spoke with prosecutors, psychiatrists, and writers. He gave interviews to television producers. He claimed to have killed many more people, sometimes saying it was over 100, sometimes 200. He said he worked for the mafia as a hitman. He claimed to have killed famous mobsters and even Jimmy Hoffa, the famous union leader who disappeared in 1975. These interviews were made into 3 HBO documentaries. They were called The Iceman Tapes. In these films, Kuklinski spoke calmly about murder. He described using guns, knives, poison, and even a crossbow. He said he killed his first person when he was just 14 years old. However, law enforcement officials did not believe most of these claims. They investigated the stories he told. They could not find any proof that he had killed all those people. They found no bodies and no evidence linking him to the famous crimes he described. One detective said Kuklinski was like Forrest Gump of mob hits, meaning he claimed to be present at every famous event, but it was not true. Experts on the mafia said his stories did not match the facts of those cases. The police who arrested him believed he probably killed about 15 people, not 200. They thought he lied to make himself seem more important and scary. In 2003, Kuklinski was charged with another murder. He confessed to killing a New York City police detective named Peter Calabro in 1980. Calabro had been shot and killed in New Jersey. Kuklinski said he did not know the man was a police officer. He claimed a mafia figure named Sammy Gravano hired him to do it. Kuklinski was given another 30-year sentence for this murder. It did not change his time in prison because he was already serving life sentences. In October 2005, after almost 18 years in prison, Kuklinski became very sick. He was diagnosed with a rare disease called Kawasaki disease. He was moved from the prison to a hospital in Trenton, New Jersey. His health got worse. He had heart disease and other problems. His ex-wife Barbara, who had divorced him in 1993, signed a do not resuscitate order. This meant that if his heart stopped, the doctors should not try to bring him back. A week before he died, the hospital called Barbara to ask if she wanted to cancel that order. She said no. On March 5, 2006, Richard Kuklinski died at the age of 70. The cause of death was cardiac arrest, which means his heart stopped. A forensic pathologist reviewed his medical records and confirmed this. He died in the hospital, still serving his life sentences. His family took his body, and he was buried. His claims of killing hundreds of people remained unproven, but he was convicted of 5 murders and died in prison for the crimes he did commit. Story 2. John David Duty was born on April 25, 1952. His father was Charles Houston Duty, and his mother was Mildred Duty Hall. John's parents did not stay together when he was young. His mother married 2 more times after she left his father. Because of this, John grew up in what he later called a broken home. He had brothers and sisters from his parents' different marriages. In total, he had 2 brothers, 1 sister, 1 half-brother, and 1 half-sister. For some time when he was young, John went by the last name Hall instead of Duty. This happened because there was confusion about who his real father was. His mother had married a man named O.H. Hall in 1950, but John's birth certificate listed his last name as Duty. When John was in the 3rd grade, he had an accident that caused him to lose one of his eyes. He wore an eye patch over that eye for the rest of his life. At another time when he was still a child, a brick wall fell on him and he hit his head. This injury was serious enough that he had to go to the hospital. While he was in the hospital for the head injury, he also caught scarlet fever and had to stay longer to recover. These events happened when he was young, but there is no record that doctors checked his brain or thinking abilities after these injuries. John's mother died when she was 46 years old. She passed away on August 24, 1973 in Altus, Oklahoma. John was 21 years old at that time. As an adult, John worked regular jobs. He was a manager at a company called Central Manufacturing in Vernon, Texas. Later he worked at Sonic Drive-In and at PepsiCo in Wichita Falls, Texas. Wichita Falls is a city in Texas near the Oklahoma border. John got married to a woman named Pam. Together they had 2 sons and 1 daughter. For a period of time, John lived a normal life with a family and steady work. But in February 1978, John did something that changed everything. On February 16, 1978, John and a man he had met only 4 or 5 days earlier committed a crime together. The other man's name was Anthony Trombitas. The 2 men robbed a store called Jiffy Mart on Falcon Road in Altus, Oklahoma. They took beer and money from the store. The amount of money was small. Some reports say $7.66. Others say $18. During the robbery, they also took the store clerk. Her name was Linda Hall. She was not related to John despite having the same last name. John and Anthony drove Linda Hall to a barn in Tillman County, Oklahoma. At the barn, John raped her. After the rape, John shot her in the back of the head 3 times with a small gun called a .22 caliber pistol. Then Anthony hit her with a stick. John later said the stick was a broom handle. They left her there, thinking she was dead. But Linda Hall was not dead. She was badly hurt, but she was able to walk 1 mile to a house where she found help. She was taken to Tillman County Memorial Hospital, and she survived. After the attack, John and Anthony drove to Frederick, Oklahoma, then to Electra, Texas, and then to Fort Worth, Texas. The next day, John heard a news report on the radio about Linda Hall. He heard that she was still alive. John later said, "I was surprised that she was still alive." John returned to Altus, Oklahoma about 1 month later. He said he came back because he thought the police would catch him anyway. He was arrested on the street in Altus. He had called the police from a payphone at another Jiffy Mart and hung up, and they found him nearby. In July 1978, John went to trial at the Jackson County Courthouse in Oklahoma. He had 2 lawyers representing him. Their names were Clyde Amix and John Wampler. The judge was Weldon Ferris. At the trial, John said he had no criminal record except for 3 tickets for traffic violations. He said he believed he could change his behavior and be helped in prison. On July 18, 1978, John pleaded guilty to the charges. He was convicted of rape in Tillman County. He was convicted of shooting with intent to kill in Tillman County. He was convicted of robbery in Jackson County. He was also convicted of kidnapping. The prosecutor, Mike Evans, asked John questions in court. John admitted that the crimes were his idea. He said he had been feeling depressed and had been drinking alcohol for 2 days before the crimes. The judge sentenced John to serve life in prison for robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison for rape. He was sentenced to life in prison for shooting with intent to kill. He was also sentenced to 20 years in prison for kidnapping. All of these sentences were to be served at the same time. This meant John would be in prison for the rest of his life, unless he was granted parole someday. John was sent to Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. This was a large prison with many inmates. On August 8, 1979, about 1 year after John arrived at the prison, he did something else. At 11:30 in the morning, John took a pair of scissors and held 8 people hostage in the prison medical unit. He had gone to the medical unit for treatment, but then he grabbed the scissors and would not let the people leave. The people he held were staff members at the prison. Prison officials did not know why John did this, because he did not make any demands. He did not ask for anything in exchange for releasing them. John let 6 of the hostages go without hurting them. About 2 hours later, he let a nurse named Virginia Nelson go free. The last hostage was a psychologist named Jim Fenwick. Jim Fenwick took John into his office and talked with him. They kept talking until John gave up at 4:02 in the afternoon that same day. No one was hurt in this incident. John was returned to his cell. John stayed in prison through the 1980s and 1990s. He continued to have problems with his behavior while locked up. In 1980, he was convicted of assault with a dangerous weapon in Pittsburgh County and sentenced to 5 more years. In 1987, he was convicted of escape from a penal institution and sentenced to 2 more years. John also took hostages 2 other times during his years in prison, and he assaulted a guard at one point. He spent much of his time in special housing units for prisoners who caused problems. By 2001, John had been in prison for 23 years. He was 49 years old. He was still at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was serving his life sentences with no chance of parole in sight. Prison records show that John had been recommended for several jobs inside the prison in the months before December 2001, but each time the recommendations were denied for reasons that were not made clear. John remained in a unit of the prison where inmates with behavior problems were housed. On December 13, 2001, prison officials at Oklahoma State Penitentiary made a decision about where to house 2 inmates. They placed a 22-year-old man named Curtis J. Wise Jr. in the same cell as John Duty. Curtis Wise had been convicted in October 1999 of burglary, larceny, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was serving a 5-year sentence for these crimes. John Duty was 49 years old and had been in prison for 23 years. The 2 men were now cellmates in the disciplinary unit of the prison. From the very first day Curtis moved into the cell, John began thinking about killing him. John later wrote that he had been planning the murder since the day Curtis moved in. He watched Curtis and thought about how to carry out his plan. 6 days passed. On the evening of December 19th, 2001, John put his plan into action. He spoke to Curtis and made him a proposal. John told Curtis that he wanted to use him as a hostage. He explained that if Curtis would let himself be tied up, the guards would think John had taken a hostage. John said this would cause the prison staff to move him to a different part of the prison called administrative segregation. This was a unit where inmates who needed to be separated from others were kept. John told Curtis that if he went along with this plan, John would give him some cigarettes as payment for helping. Curtis agreed to the plan. He did not know that John had no intention of using him as a hostage. Curtis allowed John to tie his hands behind his back. Then John tied Curtis's feet as well. Once Curtis was completely tied up and could not move or defend himself, John did something different from what he had promised. John took a shoelace and wrapped it around Curtis's neck. He pulled the shoelace tight and began to strangle Curtis. Curtis realized what was happening and struggled to breathe. He fought against the bindings on his hands and feet, but he could not free himself. John continued to pull on the shoelace. It took a long time for Curtis to die. John later said it was not like in the movies where death comes quickly. He said Curtis struggled for his life, and it took a while for him to stop breathing. John kept strangling Curtis until he was dead. Approximately 1 hour after killing Curtis, John sat down and wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to Curtis's mother, Mary Wise. In the letter, John wrote exactly what had happened and how he felt about it. He wrote, "Well, by the time you get this letter, you will already know that your son is dead. I know now because I just killed him an hour ago. Gee, you'd think I'd be feeling some remorse, but I'm not." John continued writing to Mary Wise and explained how he had done it. He told her that he had been planning since the day Curtis moved in, and that he finally carried out the plan that night. He wrote, "Would you like to know how I did it? Well, I told him I wanted to use him as a hostage. Hell, he went right for it, thinking he was going to get some smokes out of the deal. Well, I tied him up hands and feet, then I strangled him." John also wrote cruel words about Curtis. He said, "It's not like the movies, it took a while. But I really did him a favor as he was too stupid to live. I mean, he didn't know me 5 days, and he let me tie him up like that, please. Besides, he was young and dumb and would have just been in and out of prison his whole life. So I saved him all the torment." In the letter, John also wrote about himself. He said, "I've been in 24 years, wish someone would have done me the same favor back then." He then told Mary Wise that he did not think he would be punished for killing her son. He wrote that the district attorneys in that county did not care about inmates dying, and that inmates were just seen as scum. He said he was already serving 2 life sentences, so they could not hurt him any more than he was already hurt. He suggested that Mary Wise could call the authorities and tell them about the letter, but he said it would not do any good. He ended the letter by saying he would tell the police about Curtis in the morning. John put the letter in the prison mail system. But before the letter could leave the prison, it was found and taken by prison staff. They read what John had written and kept the letter as evidence. The next morning, on December 20th, 2001, an investigator named Tim Koppick interviewed John about Curtis's death. John told the investigator that he had written a letter to Curtis's mother and had mailed it. The investigator already knew about the letter because prison staff had intercepted it. The warden had been told about the letter and made sure it was taken before it left the prison. At some point after the murder, John wrote another letter. This one was to the district attorney who would handle his case. In this letter, John asked whether the district attorney intended to file murder charges against him. Then he made a proposition. John wrote that he was willing to come to the courthouse right away and plead guilty to first-degree murder. But he had one condition. He would only plead guilty if he received the death sentence. He said the district attorney could save the money that would be spent on a jury trial. John explained why he wanted the death penalty. He wrote, "I do it only for a death sentence. I'm never getting out of here with the time I'm doing. And with all my bad behavior in here, I'm never going to make parole. So there's no time you can give me that would harm me in the least way. And because of my violent record, you can't say I don't deserve the death penalty. I've killed another inmate, taken hostages 3 times, and assaulted a guard. Plus other various things too numerous to mention." John also made a threat in the letter. He wrote that if the district attorney did not give him the death penalty, then the district attorney was telling him it was okay to kill again and again because nothing would be done to him. He said, "And if that's what it takes to get you to do something, then I'll be more than happy to do it. Only next time it will be a guard or staff member, as I know you'll prosecute me then." He ended by saying the ball was in the district attorney's court and asked if the district attorney was going to do his job or allow John to continue doing his. The state of Oklahoma filed charges against John for first-degree murder. The case number was CF 2002-243 in Pittsburgh County. The state also filed a bill of particulars. This is a legal document that lists the reasons why the death penalty should be applied. The state listed 4 aggravating factors. The first was that John had been previously convicted of felonies involving violence. The second was that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The third was that John would likely commit more violent acts and be a continuing threat to society. The fourth was that the murder was committed while John was serving a prison sentence. On June 4, 2002, John appeared in court before Judge Stephen Taylor for his arraignment. At this hearing, John told the judge that he wanted to plead guilty to the murder charge. He also wanted to plead guilty to the bill of particulars, which meant he agreed that the death penalty should apply. John's own lawyers advised him not to do this. They told him it was not in his best interest. But John insisted on pleading guilty against their advice. Because John was asking for the death penalty, the judge had to make sure John was mentally competent to make this decision. The judge ordered that John be evaluated by mental health professionals. John was sent to the Carl Albert Community Mental Health Center for one evaluation. Later, he was sent to Eastern State Hospital for a second evaluation by different doctors. Both evaluations concluded that John was competent. The doctors reported that John understood the charges against him. He understood that he would likely receive the death penalty. He understood that his lawyers wanted him to do something different. He understood all of this and still wanted to plead guilty and receive death. The doctors also reported that John had never suffered from a mental disorder. They noted that if John were ever released from prison, he would be a danger to others because he had admitted he would kill again. On October 28, 2002, a hearing was held to determine John's competency. John testified on his own behalf. He answered questions from the judge. The judge reviewed the reports from both mental health evaluations. After considering everything, Judge Taylor ruled that John was competent. He was competent to understand the charges. He was competent to make decisions about his case. He was competent to plead guilty. After the competency ruling, the court moved directly to the plea hearing. John formally entered his guilty plea to first-degree murder. The judge asked him many questions to make sure he understood what he was doing. John said he understood. The judge found that there was enough factual basis for the plea, meaning the facts of the case supported a guilty finding. Then the court moved to the bill of particulars, which was the part of the case about sentencing. John also pleaded guilty to the 4 aggravating factors. He agreed that these factors applied to his case. The judge again questioned him to make sure he understood. John said he understood. The judge then asked John if he wanted to present any evidence that might convince the court to give him a sentence less than death. This type of evidence is called mitigating evidence. It could include information about John's background, his childhood, his injuries, or anything else that might explain why he did what he did. John said he did not want to present any such evidence. He He waived his right to present mitigating evidence. His lawyers told the judge that they had investigated his background and had found evidence they could present. They had talked to John about this evidence, but John still did not want it presented. He wanted the death sentence. Mary Wise, Curtis's mother, came to the court and spoke. She asked the judge to sentence John to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She said she did not believe John should have a choice in his punishment. She said she wanted John to sit in his cell and face those four walls and think about what he did for the rest of his natural life. She told John she hoped and prayed he would live to be 110 years old, because that was how long she wanted him to think about what he had done to her son. A doctor who had evaluated John also testified. He told the court that John had emphatically said he intended to continue killing if he remained in prison. After hearing everything, Judge Taylor made his ruling. He acknowledged Mary Wise's request and said he understood why she wanted John to spend his life in prison. But the judge said this case was a textbook case for the death penalty. John had a long history of violent crimes. He had killed another inmate. He had stated clearly that he would kill again. The aggravating factors were strong. The judge sentenced John to death. John was returned to Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. This was the same prison where he had strangled Curtis Wise. He was placed on death row to wait for his execution date. His first execution date was set for February 24, 2005. After his sentencing, John filed appeals. He did this even though he had wanted the death penalty. In 2004, he filed an appeal with the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. He argued that one of the aggravating factors used in his case should not have been allowed. The court reviewed his case and upheld his death sentence on April 23, 2004. In 2010, a new issue arose that affected John's case. The state of Oklahoma ran out of a drug called sodium thiopental. This drug was one of 3 drugs used in lethal injections. It was the drug that made the inmate unconscious before the other drugs were given. The only company in the United States that made sodium thiopental said new supplies would not be available until at least January 2011. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections needed to find another drug to use in executions. They decided to use a drug called pentobarbital instead of sodium thiopental. Pentobarbital was a drug commonly used to euthanize animals. It was also used as a sedative for humans in some medical situations. Oklahoma's law did not name specific drugs. It only said a fast-acting barbiturate must be used first. This gave the state the ability to change to pentobarbital. John and 2 other inmates on death row filed an appeal in federal court. Their names were John Duty and Jeffrey David Matthews. They argued that using pentobarbital could be cruel and unusual punishment. They said there was a risk that the drug might not work properly. They said an inmate might be paralyzed by the second drug, but still awake and aware when the third drug stopped his heart. The third drug was known to cause a very painful burning sensation. A hearing was held in federal court in November 2010. A professor of anesthesia from Harvard Medical School testified for the inmates. He said pentobarbital might not prevent severe, excruciating pain. But a professor of anesthesiology from the University of Massachusetts testified for the state. He said 5 grams of pentobarbital was an enormous overdose. He said it would be enough to cause unconsciousness and death within minutes, even without the other drugs. On December 14, 2010, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals made its ruling. 3 judges heard the case: Chief Judge Mary Beck Briscoe, Judge Jerome Holmes, and Judge Neil Gorsuch. They ruled unanimously that the use of pentobarbital was constitutional. They said the state's witness had more clinical experience with pentobarbital. They found that the amount of pentobarbital planned for use would likely be lethal by itself in most cases. John also filed a petition with the United States Supreme Court. He asked them to review whether Oklahoma's execution protocol was constitutional. The Supreme Court denied his petition. This meant there were no more legal barriers to his execution. The discovery of Curtis Wise's murder happened quickly because John Duty did not try to hide what he had done. On the morning of December 20th, 2001, prison staff at Oklahoma State Penitentiary found Curtis Wise dead in the cell he shared with John Duty. They saw that Curtis had been strangled. They also found that John had written a letter to Curtis's mother describing the murder in detail. Prison officials took the letter before it could be mailed. They kept it as evidence. An investigator named Tim Koppick interviewed John that same morning. John told the investigator that he had written a letter to Curtis's mother and had put it in the mail. The investigator already knew about the letter because prison staff had intercepted it. John did not deny killing Curtis. He spoke freely about what he had done. The investigation was straightforward because John admitted to the crime. The physical evidence was clear. Curtis had died from strangulation. The bindings on his hands and feet showed that he had been tied up before he was killed. John's own words in the letter explained exactly how and why he had done it. There was no question about who had committed the murder. John was charged with first-degree murder in Pittsburgh County, Oklahoma. The case number was CF 2002-243. Because John was already in prison, there was no need for police to arrest him. He was already in custody. The legal process moved forward over several months. John appeared in court on June 4, 2002 for his arraignment. At this hearing, he told the judge he wanted to plead guilty. But because he was asking for the death penalty, the judge had to make sure John was mentally competent to make that choice. The court ordered 2 competency evaluations. Doctors examined John, and both times concluded that he was competent. They said he understood the charges against him and understood that he would likely receive the death penalty. They also noted that John had admitted he would kill again if he stayed in prison. On October 28, 2002, a competency hearing was held. John testified. The judge reviewed the doctor's reports. The judge ruled that John was competent to plead guilty. After that ruling, John entered his guilty plea to first-degree murder. He also pleaded guilty to the Bill of Particulars, which meant he agreed that the 4 aggravating factors applied to his case. These factors were: he had prior violent felony convictions, the murder was especially heinous and cruel, he would be a continuing threat to society, and he committed the murder while serving a prison sentence. John told the judge he did not want to present any evidence that might convince the court to give him a life sentence instead of death. This type of evidence is called mitigating evidence. John's lawyers told the judge they had investigated his background and found evidence they could present. They had talked to John about it, but John still refused to let them present it. He wanted the death sentence. Mary Wise, Curtis's mother, came to the sentencing hearing. She spoke directly to the court and to John. She asked the judge to sentence John to life in prison without parole. She said she did not want John to have the choice of dying. She wanted him to sit in his cell for the rest of his life and think about what he had done to her son. She told John she hoped he lived to be 110 years old, so he would have many years to think about killing Curtis. The judge listened to Mary Wise. He said he understood why she wanted John to suffer in prison for a long time. But the judge also looked at the facts of the case. John had a long history of violent crimes. He had killed another inmate. He had said clearly that he would kill again. The judge called this a textbook case for the death penalty. He sentenced John to death. After the sentencing, John was returned to Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was placed on death row to wait for his execution. His first execution date was set for February 24, 2005. John did not immediately accept his sentence without legal challenge. Even though he had asked for the death penalty, he filed appeals. In 2004, he filed an appeal with the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. He argued that one of the aggravating factors used in his case, the continuing threat factor, should not have been allowed. The court reviewed his case and upheld his death sentence on April 23, 2004. The court found that there was enough evidence to support all 4 aggravating factors. They noted that John had admitted he would kill again if he did not get the death penalty. In 2004, John also filed a petition for post-conviction relief. This is a legal process where a person who has been convicted can raise new issues that were not raised during the trial. In this petition, John raised a new argument. He said his trial lawyers had not done enough to investigate his background and find evidence that might have convinced the court to give him a life sentence instead of death. He presented new evidence to support this claim. The new evidence included an affidavit from an investigator named Dorothy Walos. She had looked into John's background after he was sentenced. She said she found evidence of head injuries from John's childhood, abuse, and possible mental illness. She also found prison records showing that John had been recommended for prison jobs in the months before Curtis's murder, but the recommendations had been denied. She argued that this information might have been used as mitigating evidence at his sentencing. John also presented a report from a psychologist named Dr. Gilbert Sanders. Dr. Sanders had evaluated John in August 2004. He diagnosed John with major depressive disorder and a somatoform disorder. He said John had suffered at least 2 significant head injuries as a child, one at age 10 and one at age 17. He said John had cognitive problems in some areas. But Dr. Sanders also said that John knew right from wrong and could choose to do right. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed this new evidence. On October 11, 2004, they denied John's petition. The court found that even if John's lawyers had done more investigation, John would not have changed his mind about wanting the death penalty. The court noted that John's entire plan from the beginning was to kill someone so that the state would kill him. He had stated clearly that he would kill again if he did not receive the death penalty. The court concluded that John was not prejudiced by anything his lawyers did or did not do. On January 13, 2005, John filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus in federal court. This is a legal action where a person in prison asks a federal court to review whether their imprisonment is lawful. John raised several issues in his federal petition. He again argued that his lawyers had been ineffective for not investigating his background. He also argued that 2 of the aggravating factors in his case were duplicative, meaning they covered the same thing. He challenged the constitutionality of the continuing threat factor. He argued that his prior violent felonies were too old to be used against him. And he challenged Oklahoma's method of execution. While the federal case was pending, John wrote 2 letters to the court. In April 2005, he wrote a letter saying he wanted to stop his appeals. The court held a hearing and ordered another competency evaluation. The evaluation found John competent. In August 2005, John withdrew his request to stop the appeals and said he wanted to continue. In January 2007, he wrote another letter asking to stop the proceedings, but then wrote 4 days later to rescind that request. He said he had been frustrated about lack of medical attention and the hopelessness of prison, but he had spoken with his lawyers and wanted to proceed. On August 17, 2007, the federal district court denied John's habeas petition. The court ruled against him on all his claims. On the ineffective assistance of counsel claim, the court agreed with the state court that John had not shown prejudice. Even if his lawyers had done more investigation, John had made it clear he wanted the death penalty and would not have changed his mind. The court also ruled that John's challenge to Oklahoma's execution method was procedurally barred. This meant he had not raised it in state court when he should have, so he could not raise it now in federal court. John asked for a certificate of appealability so he could appeal to a higher court. The district court granted the certificate on 2 issues: the ineffective assistance of counsel claim and the challenge to the execution method. John's case went to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado. On December 14, 2010, the 10th Circuit issued its ruling. The three judges on the panel were Chief Judge Mary Beck Briscoe, Judge Jerome Holmes, and Judge Neil Gorsuch. They ruled unanimously against John. On the ineffective assistance of counsel claim, the 10th Circuit agreed with the lower courts that John had not shown prejudice. The court compared John's case to a recent Supreme Court case called Schreiro v. Landrigan. In that case, the Supreme Court had ruled that a defendant who refuses to let his lawyers present mitigating evidence cannot later claim prejudice because they did not investigate enough. John had done exactly that. He had refused to let his lawyers present any mitigating evidence at his sentencing. The court also noted that John's own words showed he would not have changed his mind. He had written to the district attorney that he wanted death. He had told the court he would kill again if he did not get death. He had written a letter to Curtis's mother bragging about the murder. The court said there was no reasonable probability that anything would have changed the outcome. On the execution method claim, the 10th Circuit ruled that John had not raised this issue in state court when he could have. Oklahoma's three-drug protocol had been in place since 1977. John could have challenged it in his state court proceedings, but did not. Because he failed to exhaust his state remedies, the claim was procedurally defaulted. John had not shown good cause for this failure, so the court would not consider the claim. John also filed a petition with the United States Supreme Court. He asked them to review whether Oklahoma's execution protocol was constitutional. On a date in December 2010, the Supreme Court denied his petition. This meant there were no more legal barriers to his execution. With all appeals exhausted, the Oklahoma Department of Corrections scheduled John's execution for December 16, 2010. The execution would take place at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, the same prison where John had strangled Curtis Wise nearly 9 years earlier. On the day of the execution, December 16, 2010, John was allowed to request a final meal. He asked for a loaded double cheeseburger with mayonnaise, a foot-long hot dog with cheese, mustard and extra onions, a cherry limeade, and a large banana shake. Prison officials provided this meal to him at noon. After his meal, John met with a prison chaplain. He also met with his attorneys and with members of his family. His brother and sister-in-law came to the prison to be with him on his last day. At 6:12 in the evening, the execution began. John was strapped to a gurney. He wore an eye patch over his right eye, just as he had for most of his life. The medical team inserted intravenous lines into his arms. A second line was prepared as a backup in case the first one failed. Before the drugs were administered, John was given the opportunity to make a final statement. He spoke to the people in the witness room. His words were directed to the family of Curtis Wise. He said, "To the family of Curtis Wise, I'd like to make my apology. I hope one day you'll be able to forgive me, not for my sake, but for your own. My family and friends are here too. Thank you. You've all been a blessing. Thank you, Lord Jesus. I'm ready to go home." The witnesses in the room included members of the media, John's legal team, and his brother and sister-in-law. Mary Wise and other members of Curtis's family did not attend the execution. The drugs began to flow through the intravenous lines at 6:12 p.m. The first drug was pentobarbital, the sedative that Oklahoma was using for the first time in an execution. This was followed by vecuronium bromide, a drug that paralyzes the muscles and stops breathing. The third drug was potassium chloride, which stops the heart. As the drugs took effect, John continued to speak. He repeated, "Thank you, Lord," several times. 1 minute after the drugs began, at 6:13 p.m., his breathing became labored. At 6:15 p.m., he appeared to stop breathing. The color began to drain from his face. At 6:18 p.m., John David Duty was pronounced dead. After the execution, Oklahoma Department of Corrections spokesman Jerry Massey spoke to the media. He said there did not appear to be any issues with the new drug. The execution had proceeded without any visible problems. John David Duty was 58 years old when he died. He was survived by his 2 sons, his daughter, and several grandchildren. He was the last person executed in the United States in 2010. He was also the first person in the United States to be executed using pentobarbital as part of the lethal injection process. The case drew attention from groups on both sides of the death penalty debate. The National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty used John's case as an example in their arguments against capital punishment. They pointed out that John had planned to kill someone specifically so that he would be executed. They said this showed that the death penalty does not deter murder, but can actually encourage it. They noted that John had used the system to turn the state into an agent of his own suicide. However, they did not question that John was guilty of killing Curtis Wise. Curtis J. Wise Jr. was 22 years old when he died. He had been serving a 5-year sentence for burglary, larceny, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was placed in a cell with John Duty on December 13, 2001. 6 days later, he was dead. The reason why prison officials housed him with John Duty, a man serving multiple life sentences with a long history of violence, was never publicly explained. Mary Wise, Curtis's mother, had asked the court to let John spend the rest of his life in prison thinking about what he had done. Instead, John received the death sentence he had asked for. He died 9 years after killing her son, without spending decades in a cell facing those 4 walls as she had hoped. The state of Oklahoma had carried out the sentence that John David Duty had asked for and received, and the case of the man who killed to be killed was closed. Story 3. Philip Ray Workman was born on June 1, 1953, at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Fort Campbell was a large military base, and because his father was in the Army, Philip grew up in a military family. This meant his family did not stay in one place for very long. Instead, they moved to different Army bases whenever his father was assigned to a new post. As a result, Philip spent his childhood living on various military installations, surrounded by the structure and order of Army life. When he became a young man, Philip followed the path he knew best. He joined the United States Army. He served in the military for a time, but his life after the service took a very different turn. In 1973, shortly after he was discharged from the Army, Philip got into serious trouble. He was in Georgia when he committed a burglary and was also found with illegal drugs. For these crimes, he was sentenced to 5 years in a Georgia prison. He ended up serving 25 months of that sentence before being released. This was his first major experience with the criminal justice system as an adult, and it added to his record, which already included a past conviction for aggravated assault. By 1981, Philip was 28 years old. He was married and had an 8-year-old daughter. The family was living in Columbus, Georgia. But Philip was facing a serious problem. He was heavily addicted to cocaine. The drug had a strong hold on his life. That summer, he decided to leave his family in Georgia and hitchhike to Memphis, Tennessee. He arrived in Memphis in early August 1981. He was carrying a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. In early August 1981, Philip Workman was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was staying in the city with no job and no money. His addiction to cocaine was still very strong, and he needed money to buy more drugs. He began to think about robbing a place to get cash. He had his .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol with him. On the evening of August 5th, 1981, Workman went to a Wendy's restaurant on Poplar Avenue in Memphis. He walked inside with his pistol. He showed the gun and demanded money from the employees. The people working there were scared. They did what he said. One of the employees was a woman. She asked Workman if she could stand up because she had a cramp in her leg. Workman told her she could. When she stood up, she was able to reach a silent alarm button without Workman seeing her. She pressed it. This sent a signal to the police that the restaurant was being robbed. While Workman was still collecting the money, 3 Memphis police officers arrived at the Wendy's. Their names were Lieutenant Ronald Oliver, Officer Aubrey Stoddard, and Officer Stephen Parker. They came because of the silent alarm. When Workman saw the police cars pull up outside, he stopped the robbery and ran out the back door of the restaurant. He ran across a parking lot next to the building, trying to get away. The 3 police officers saw him running. Lieutenant Oliver chased him on foot across the parking lot. Officer Stoddard and Officer Parker also moved in to catch him. As Workman ran, he turned and fired his .45 caliber pistol at the officers. One of the bullets hit Lieutenant Oliver in the chest. Lieutenant Oliver fell to the ground. He died from this gunshot wound. Workman also shot Officer Stoddard in the arm, injuring him. He fired his gun at Officer Parker as well, but Officer Parker was not hit. The officers returned fire. Officer Stoddard and Officer Parker both shot at Workman. One of their bullets hit Workman. Workman fell to the ground because he was shot. He was badly wounded but still alive. The shooting stopped. Other police officers arrived quickly. They arrested Workman at the scene. He was taken to a hospital for treatment of his gunshot wound. Officer Stoddard was also taken to a hospital for his arm. Both men recovered from their injuries. Lieutenant Ronald Oliver, however, was dead. He was a 42-year-old father and a 17-year veteran of the Memphis Police Department. While he was in the hospital recovering, Workman spoke to the police. He admitted that he had fired the shot that killed Lieutenant Oliver. He said he did not mean to kill the lieutenant, but he admitted to firing his gun during the chase. After he was well enough to leave the hospital, Workman was formally charged with the murder of Lieutenant Oliver. He was put in jail to wait for his trial, which would take place the following year, in 1982. Philip Workman's trial for the murder of Lieutenant Ronald Oliver began in 1982 in Memphis. The main person speaking against him was a man named Harold Davis. Mr. Davis testified in court that he had been in the Wendy's parking lot on the night of the robbery. He said he was only about 10 feet away from the shooting. He told the jury that he clearly saw Workman fire the gun that killed Lieutenant Oliver. The lawyers representing Workman did not bring in their own experts to check the bullets or the guns. They did not investigate Mr. Davis's story. Workman himself took the stand and admitted he fired his gun, but he said he did not plan to kill anyone. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Workman guilty of murder. They then decided he should be put to death. The judge agreed and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. For many years after the trial, Workman's lawyers worked to appeal the case. They tried to prove there were mistakes. A major development happened in November 1999. Harold Davis, the key witness, signed a statement saying his trial testimony was false. He said he had not actually seen the shooting. He explained that he had called the police with a fake story back in 1981 because he wanted to get a reward to buy drugs. He also claimed that people had threatened his family to stop him from changing his story later. This new information led to more court hearings. Workman's lawyers also brought in a medical expert, Dr. Cyril Wecht. Dr. Wecht studied pictures of Lieutenant Oliver's wounds. He said the bullet that killed the lieutenant likely did not come from Workman's .45 caliber gun. He explained that the type of bullet Workman used usually stays inside a person's body. The bullet that killed Lieutenant Oliver went through his body, and the exit wound was smaller than the entrance wound. This was more consistent with the smaller .38 caliber bullets fired by the police officers at the scene. Workman's lawyers argued that either Officer Stoddard or Officer Parker might have accidentally shot the lieutenant in the chaos. However, the officers' guns had never been tested back in 1981. Over time, other doubts emerged. 5 of the original jurors from the 1982 trial signed statements, saying they now had doubts about the verdict or the death sentence. One juror said that if he had heard the new ballistics evidence back then, he would have found Workman not guilty. Even the daughter of Lieutenant Oliver and the former district attorney, who had prosecuted Workman, asked the governor of Tennessee to stop the execution. 2 justices on the Tennessee Supreme Court also expressed concerns about the case. In 2000, just 37 minutes before a scheduled execution, the state Supreme Court stopped it and ordered a new hearing to look at the new evidence. That new hearing took place in 2002. It was held by the same judge who had overseen the original trial in 1982, Judge John P. Colton. At this hearing, Harold Davis did not clearly say his original testimony was a lie. He said he could not remember the events well. Dr. Wecht gave his opinion on the bullet, but he admitted he could not be 100% certain. Judge Colton ruled against Workman. He decided the new evidence was not strong enough to overturn the original verdict. He stated that Harold Davis had not truly taken back his testimony, and that the ballistics information was similar to what the jury had already heard. Workman's appeals continued through the courts for several more years, but all of them were denied. In May 2007, Workman's final appeals ran out. The courts refused to stop the execution. On May 8, 2007, the day he was scheduled to die, Workman was asked what he wanted for his last meal. He did not ask for anything for himself. Instead, he requested that a large vegetarian pizza be given to a homeless person in Memphis. The prison officials denied this request. Because of this, Workman chose not to eat anything at all. That night, people all across the country heard about his request. Many of them ordered pizzas and had them delivered to homeless shelters in Tennessee to honor what Workman had tried to do. In the early hours of May 9, 2007, Philip Workman was led to the execution chamber. When asked for his last words, he said a prayer. At 1:38 a.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 53 years old. After his death, there was a legal dispute over whether an autopsy should be performed. Workman had requested that his body not be cut open. His brother argued in court that this was against his religious beliefs as a Seventh-day Adventist. A judge eventually allowed a less invasive examination to take place. The legal battle over the case, which had lasted for 25 years, finally came to an end with his execution. Story 4. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945 in Fraserburgh, a small coastal town in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His mother was Elizabeth White, and his father was Olav Nilsen, a Norwegian soldier who had come to Scotland during the war as part of the Free Norwegian Forces. Dennis was the second of 3 children. He had an older brother named Olav Jr. and a younger sister named Sylvia. His parents married in May 1942 after knowing each other only a short time, and they moved into the home of Elizabeth's parents. The marriage between Dennis's parents was not a happy one. His father did not take married life seriously and spent most of his time with his military duties rather than with his wife. He made little effort to find a home for his family. After Sylvia was born, Dennis's mother realized she had rushed into marriage without thinking things through properly. The couple divorced in 1948 when Dennis was 3 years old. All 3 children had been born during their father's brief visits home. After the divorce, Dennis's mother moved back to live with her own parents, Andrew and Lily White, who helped her raise the children. Andrew and Lily had never approved of their daughter's choice of husband, but they were kind to their grandchildren. Dennis was a quiet child, but he did enjoy adventures. His earliest memories were of family picnics in the Scottish countryside with his mother and siblings. He also remembered his grandparents' religious and simple way of life, which he later described as cold and without much joy. But his best memories were of going on long walks with his maternal grandfather, Andrew White. His grandfather was a fisherman who would carry Dennis on his shoulders along the harbor, across the wide beach, up to the sand dunes, and on to nearby villages. Dennis's brother and sister sometimes came on these walks too. Even though Dennis was only 5 years old at the time, he remembered these walks very clearly. He later said this part of his childhood was a time of happiness. He called his grandfather his great hero and protector, and he felt that life was empty whenever his grandfather was away at sea. In 1951, when Dennis was 6 years old, his grandfather's health began to get worse. But Andrew White continued to work as a fisherman. On October 31st, 1951, he was fishing in the North Sea when he had a heart attack and died. He was 62 years old. His body was brought back to the family home. Dennis's mother was crying, and she asked Dennis if he wanted to see his grandfather. Dennis said yes. He was taken into the room where his grandfather lay in an open coffin. Dennis looked at the body. His mother told him that his grandfather was sleeping and had gone to a better place. This moment stayed in Dennis's mind for the rest of his life. After his grandfather died, Dennis changed. He became even more quiet and withdrawn. He would often stand alone at the harbor watching the fishing boats. At home, he did not join in family activities much. He pulled away when adult family members tried to show him affection. He also began to feel that his mother, grandmother, and later his stepfather paid too much attention to his older brother and younger sister. He envied his brother's popularity, but he stayed close to his younger sister Sylvia and talked to her and played with her more than anyone else in the family after his grandfather died. When Dennis was about 9 or 10 years old, he had a frightening experience at the beach near his home. He went into the water and got pulled under. He could not get back up and started to panic. He flailed his arms and shouted for help. He felt like he was drowning and gasping for air that was not there. He thought for a moment that his grandfather would come and pull him out. Then he felt strangely calm. Another young person who was nearby pulled him out of the water and saved his life. Soon after this, Dennis's mother moved out of her parents' home and into a flat with her 3 children. She later married a builder named Andrew Scott. They had 4 more children over the next 4 years. At first, Dennis did not like his stepfather, who he felt was too strict and unfair. But over time, he came to respect him, even if he did not show it openly. In 1955, the family moved to another small town called Stricken. When Dennis reached the age when his body was changing and he began to notice sexual feelings, he realized he was attracted to other boys. This confused him and made him feel ashamed. He did not tell anyone in his family or his few friends about these feelings. He noticed that many of the boys he found attractive had facial features similar to his sister Sylvia. On a few occasions, he touched Sylvia in a sexual way while she was sleeping. He told himself that maybe his attraction to boys was really about the caring feelings he had for his sister. He did not try to have sexual contact with any boys his own age, although he later said that an older youth had touched him once, and he did not find it unpleasant. He also touched his older brother's body while he slept. Because of this, Olav Jr. began to suspect his brother was gay and would sometimes make fun of him in public, calling him a girl. Dennis thought that what he had done with his sister might mean he was attracted to both men and women. As Dennis became a teenager, he found life in Stricken boring and limited. There was not much to do and not many job opportunities. He respected that his parents worked hard to provide for the family, but he resented that they were poorer than most of the families around them. He noticed that his mother and stepfather did not try to improve their situation. Because of this, he rarely invited friends to his home. When he was 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force. He thought the Army might be his way to escape the small town and build a different life for himself. Dennis did well enough in school, especially in history and art. He did not like sports. He finished school in 1961 and took a short job at a factory where they canned food. He used this time to think about what he wanted to do next. After only 3 weeks at the factory, he told his mother he had decided to join the army and train to become a chef. He passed the entrance tests and was told he would begin his service in September 1961. He went for training at a base in Aldershot, Hampshire, with the Army Catering Corps. Within weeks of starting his army training, Dennis began to do very well. He later said that his 3 years of training at Aldershot were the happiest of his life. He enjoyed the travel opportunities that came with the job. One of the best moments he remembered was when his regiment took part in a big parade that the Queen and a famous general attended. While he was at Aldershot, Dennis's sexual feelings toward men continued, but he kept them hidden from everyone. He never showered with the other soldiers because he was afraid he might get an erection in front of them. Instead, he bathed alone in the bathroom, which also gave him privacy to masturbate without anyone knowing. In mid-1964, Dennis passed his final catering exam and was sent to serve with the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany. He was a private soldier. While in Germany, he started drinking more alcohol than before. He said that he and his fellow soldiers drank a lot. His colleagues noticed that he often drank too much to help himself feel less shy around people. One time, he and a young German man drank until they passed out. When Dennis woke up, he was on the floor of the German man's flat. Nothing sexual had happened between them, but this incident made Dennis think more about his sexual fantasies. These fantasies usually involved a young, thin man who did nothing during sex but just lay there. Over time, these fantasies changed so that the other person in his mind was not conscious or was dead. On several occasions when he was drinking heavily with other soldiers, Dennis would pretend to be more drunk than he really was. He did this hoping that one of them might touch his body while he seemed to be unconscious. After 2 years in Germany, Dennis returned to Aldershot. He passed his official catering exam and then was sent to serve as a cook for the British Army in Norway. In 1967, he was sent to Aden, which is now part of Yemen. There he worked as a cook in a prison. This posting was more dangerous than his earlier ones. He later remembered that several men in his regiment were killed, often in attacks while traveling to the army base. Dennis himself was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver. The driver beat him until he lost consciousness and put him in the boot of the car. When Dennis woke up and was pulled out of the boot, he grabbed a metal handle and hit the taxi driver until the man fell to the ground. He hit him until he was unconscious, then locked the man in the boot of the taxi. Unlike his earlier postings, Dennis had his own room while in Aden. This meant he could masturbate without anyone finding out. He still had not acted on his fantasies about sex with someone who was not conscious or was dead. To satisfy himself, he would imagine having sex with an unconscious body while he looked at his own naked body in a mirror. One time, he found that if he put a mirror in a certain position so that he could not see his own head, he could imagine he was watching himself having sex with another man. In his mind during these moments, he was sometimes the stronger partner and sometimes the passive one. Over time, these fantasies began to include memories of his near-death experience with the taxi driver, the dead bodies he had seen in Aden, and images from an old painting he had seen. The painting showed an old man holding the naked, limp body of a dead young man, while sitting next to the cut-up body of another young male. In one fantasy Dennis remembered very clearly, a young, attractive soldier who had just been killed in battle was taken by an old man who washed his body and then had sex with it. When his time in Aden ended, Dennis returned to Britain and was sent to serve with a different regiment in Plymouth, Devon. He cooked for 30 soldiers and 2 officers every day. He stayed there for 1 year, then was sent with his regiment to Cyprus in 1969. A few months later, the regiment moved to West Berlin. That same year, Dennis had sex with a woman for the first time. He paid a prostitute for her services. He told his fellow soldiers about it, but later said he did not enjoy it and found it depressing. After a short time with his regiment in Inverness, Scotland, Dennis was chosen to cook for the Queen's Royal Guard. Then in January 1971, he was sent to the Shetland Islands to cook for a different regiment. He ended his army career there in October 1972. He had served for 11 years and reached the rank of corporal. Between October and December 1972, Dennis lived with his family in Stricken while he decided what to do next. During this time, his mother told him more than once that she was worried he did not have a girlfriend. She wanted him to get married and start a family. One evening, Dennis watched a television documentary about gay men with his brother, his sister-in-law, and another couple. Everyone in the room made fun of the gay men in the program, but Dennis spoke up strongly to defend them. This led to an argument and then a fight. After that, his brother told their mother that Dennis was gay. Dennis never spoke to his older brother again. He only had occasional contact by letter with his mother, stepfather, and younger siblings after that. He decided to join the Metropolitan Police in London, and he moved there in December to begin his training. In April 1973, Dennis finished his police training and was sent to work in Willesden Green, London. As a new police officer, he made several arrests but never had to use force against anyone. He liked the work, but he missed the friendships he had in the army. He started drinking alone in the evenings. During the summer and autumn of 1973, he began going to gay pubs and had several brief sexual encounters with men. He did not enjoy these meetings. He felt they were empty and that he was just lending his body to strangers while searching for something more meaningful. He wanted a lasting relationship but could not find one. In August 1973, after one relationship ended badly, Dennis decided that his personal life did not fit with his job as a police officer. That same month, his birth father died in Ghana and left each of his 3 children £1,000. In December, Dennis quit the police force. For the next few months, Dennis worked as a security guard, but the work was not steady. He decided to find more stable employment. In May 1974, he started working as a civil servant. His first job was at a job center in Denmark Street, where he helped unskilled workers find jobs. At work, people knew him as a quiet and careful employee who took his job seriously. He was active in the trade union. His attendance was not perfect, but he often volunteered to work extra hours. Some of his colleagues thought he must be a loner because he worked so much overtime. In 1979, he was given more responsibility in his job. In June 1982, he was promoted again and transferred to another job center in Kentish Town. He stayed in this job until his arrest. In November 1975, Dennis met a 20-year-old man named David Galachon. David was being threatened by 2 other men outside a pub, and Dennis stepped in to help him. He took David back to his small room in Cricklewood, North London. They spent the evening drinking and talking. Dennis learned that David had recently moved to London from Somerset, that he was gay, that he did not have a job, and that he was living in a hostel. The next morning, they agreed to find a larger place to live together. Dennis used part of the money his father had left him to look for a bigger property. A few days later, they found an empty ground floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood and decided to move in. Before they moved, Dennis arranged with the landlord that he and David would have private use of the garden behind the flat. The flat was supposed to have furniture, but when they moved in, there was almost nothing there. Over the next few months, they decorated and bought furniture for the whole place. David did most of the work because Dennis had discovered that David was not interested in getting a job. Dennis began to see himself as the main earner in their relationship. He later said he was sexually attracted to David, but they rarely had sex. At first, Dennis was happy living with David. But within a year, their relationship began to have problems. They slept in separate beds, and both started bringing casual sexual partners home. David later said that Dennis never hit him, but he did yell at him and say mean things. By early 1976, they were arguing more and more. In May 1977, after a heated argument, Dennis told David to leave. But David later told police that he was the one who decided to end the relationship. Over the next 18 months, Dennis had brief relationships with several other young men. None of these relationships lasted more than a few weeks, and none of the men wanted to live with him permanently. By late 1978, Dennis was living alone. He had gone through at least 3 failed relationships in the previous year and a half. He later said he had begun to believe he was not fit to live with anyone. Throughout 1978, he put more and more of his time and energy into his work. He spent most evenings at home drinking spirits or beer and listening to music by himself. The first person Dennis Nilsen killed was a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes. On December 30th, 1978, Dennis was drinking heavily alone at his flat in Melrose Avenue. In the evening, he decided he had to leave his flat and find company. He went to a nearby pub called the Cricklewood Arms. There he saw Stephen, who was trying to buy alcohol, but could not because he was too young. Dennis thought Stephen looked about 17 years old. He invited the boy back to his flat with the promise of drinking alcohol and listening to music together. Stephen agreed and went with Dennis. At the flat, both Dennis and Stephen drank a lot of alcohol. They both fell asleep. When Dennis woke up the next morning, he found Stephen still asleep beside him on the bed. Dennis later wrote about this moment. He said he was afraid to wake Stephen in case the boy left him. He reached out and touched the sleeping youth. Then he decided that Stephen was going to stay with him over the new year, whether he wanted to or not. Dennis picked up a necktie and got on top of Stephen. He strangled him with the tie until he was unconscious. Then he drowned the boy in a bucket filled with water. After Stephen was dead, Dennis washed the body in his bathtub. He put Stephen on his bed and touched his body. He masturbated over the body twice. Then he waited for the body to become less stiff so he could hide it under the floorboards of his flat. Stephen's body stayed under the floorboards for almost 8 months. On August 11th, 1979, Dennis built a bonfire in the garden behind his flat and burned the body. He later wrote about how he would sometimes take the body out from under the floorboards to wash it again and look at it. He said the skin stayed pale and the limbs became more relaxed each time he handled it. On October 11th, 1979, Dennis tried to kill another person. He met a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho in a pub in St. Martin's Lane. He lured Andrew back to his flat with the promise of sex. Dennis tried to strangle him, but Andrew managed to fight back and escape from the flat. Andrew reported what happened to the police. Police came and questioned Dennis about the incident. But Andrew decided he did not want to press charges against Dennis, so no action was taken. On December 3rd, 1979, Dennis met a 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Ockenden. They were both drinking in a pub in the West End of London. Dennis learned that Kenneth was visiting England to see relatives. He offered to show Kenneth some famous places in London. Kenneth accepted this offer. Then Dennis invited him back to his flat for a meal and more drinks. On the way, they stopped at a shop to buy whiskey, rum, and beer. Kenneth insisted on paying for half of it. Dennis later said he could not remember the exact moment he killed Kenneth. But he did remember that he strangled him with the cord from his own headphones while Kenneth was listening to music. He dragged Kenneth across the floor with the wire still wrapped around his neck as he strangled him. After Kenneth was dead, Dennis poured himself a glass of rum and continued listening to music on the same headphones he had used to kill him. The next day, Dennis bought a Polaroid camera. He took photographs of Kenneth's body in different positions. Then he laid the body on top of him on the bed while he watched television for several hours. After that, he wrapped the body in plastic bags and hid it under the floorboards. Over the next 2 weeks, Dennis took Kenneth's body out from under the floorboards about 4 times. He would sit the body in his armchair next to him while he watched television and drank alcohol. On May 17, 1980, Dennis killed his 3rd victim. This was a 16-year-old boy named Martin Duffy from Birkenhead. Martin had run away from home without telling his parents. He had been sleeping outside near Euston Railway Station for 4 days. Dennis met him as he was returning from a union meeting in Southport. Dennis could see that Martin was tired and hungry. The boy happily accepted Dennis's offer of a meal and a place to sleep for the night. After Martin fell asleep in Dennis's bed, Dennis made a loop with a cord and put it around the boy's neck. He sat on Martin's chest and pulled the cord very tight. He held it until Martin stopped breathing and became unconscious. Then Dennis dragged the boy into the kitchen and drowned him in the sink. Afterward, Dennis got into the bath with the body. He later said Martin's body was the youngest looking he had ever seen. Dennis put Martin's body on a kitchen chair first, then on the bed. He kissed the body many times, said nice things to it, and touched it. He masturbated while sitting on the stomach of the body. He kept Martin's body in a cupboard for 2 days. But when he noticed the body was starting to swell as it decomposed, he put it under the floorboards. After Martin's murder, Dennis began to kill more often. Before the end of 1980, he killed 5 more people and tried to kill 1 other. Only one of these victims has ever been identified. His name was William Sutherland, a 26-year-old man from Edinburgh who sometimes worked as a male prostitute. Dennis could not remember exactly how he killed William. He only remembered that he strangled him and that in the morning there was another dead body. The other victims from this time have never been identified. Dennis gave vague descriptions of them to police later. One was a tall Irish laborer with rough hands. Another was a thin male prostitute who looked like he might be from the Philippines or Mexico. Another was an English homeless man in his 20s who had several missing teeth. Dennis found him sleeping in a doorway and took him home in a taxi. This victim was strangled while he slept. Dennis noted that his legs moved like he was riding a bicycle as he was being strangled. Dennis later said killing this man was as easy as taking candy from a baby. Dennis also killed what he described as a long-haired hippie in late 1980. He cut this body into 3 pieces and put the pieces back under the floorboards. He burned the remains a year later. By this time, there were so many bodies under the floorboards that they attracted insects and created a terrible smell, especially during the summer. When Dennis took bodies out from under the floorboards, he saw that they were covered with pupae and crawling with maggots. Some of the heads had maggots coming out of the eye sockets and mouths. To kill the maggots, Dennis sprinkled salt on the bodies. He also put deodorizers under the floorboards and sprayed insecticide around his flat twice a day. But the smell of decay and the flies stayed. In late 1980, Dennis took all the bodies from under the floorboards and cut them up. He burned them on a large bonfire he built on waste ground behind his flat. There were 6 bodies on this fire. To hide the smell of burning flesh, he put an old car tire on top of the fire. 3 children from the neighborhood came to watch the fire burn. Dennis later wrote that he thought it would have seemed right if those children had been dancing around a funeral fire. When the fire had burned down to ashes, Dennis used a rake to look for any bones that were still whole. He saw a skull that had not burned completely, so he smashed it into pieces with his rake. On or around January 4th, 1981, Dennis met another victim at the Golden Lion pub in Soho. This was a young Scottish man with blonde hair and blue eyes. Dennis thought he was about 18 years old. He lured him back to Melrose Avenue by suggesting they have a drinking contest. After they had drunk several glasses of alcohol together, Dennis strangled him with a tie and put the body under the floorboards. On January 12th, Dennis told his work that he was sick so he could stay home and cut up this body along with another victim he had killed about a month earlier. In February 1981, Dennis killed another man he could not identify later. All he remembered was that this victim was from Belfast, had dark hair, was in his early 20s, and was about 5 feet 9 inches tall. Dennis met him somewhere in the West End after the pubs had closed. He strangled him with a tie and put him under the floorboards. In April 1981, Dennis killed a young English skinhead. He met this victim at a food stall in Leicester Square. The young man was muscular, wore a black leather jacket, and had a tattoo around his neck that said "Cut Here." He boasted about how tough he was and how much he liked to fight. Dennis lured him home with the promise of food and alcohol. After killing him, Dennis hung the naked body in his bedroom for 24 hours before putting it under the floorboards. Throughout this time, the bodies under the floorboards continued to cause problems with smell and insects. Dennis would sometimes take them out and look at them. He later said he masturbated while kneeling or sitting next to the bodies each time before he cut them up for burning. He called this his way of saying goodbye to them. The last person Dennis killed at Melrose Avenue was a 23-year-old man named Malcolm Barlow. On September 17, 1981, Dennis found Malcolm slumped against a wall outside his home. Malcolm had epilepsy and was taking medication for it. The medication had made his legs weak, so he could not stand properly. Dennis asked if he was okay. He helped Malcolm into his flat and called for an ambulance to take him to the hospital. The next day, Malcolm was released from the hospital and came back to Dennis's flat to thank him. Dennis invited him in, gave him a meal, and they drank rum and coke together. Malcolm fell asleep on the sofa. While he slept, Dennis strangled him with his hands. The next morning, he put Malcolm's body under the kitchen sink. In mid-1981, Dennis's landlord decided to make repairs to 195 Melrose Avenue. He asked Dennis to move out. Dennis did not want to leave at first, but the landlord offered him £1,000 to leave the property. Dennis accepted this offer. On October 5, 1981, he moved into an attic flat at 23D, Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill area of North London. The day before he moved, Dennis burned the cut-up bodies of the last 5 victims he had killed at Melrose Avenue on one final bonfire in the garden. Again, he put an old car tire on top to hide the smell of burning flesh. At Cranley Gardens, Dennis lived in an attic flat. He did not have access to a garden, and he could not hide bodies under the floorboards because of how the flat was built. For almost 2 months, he did not attack anyone he brought home. But on November 23, 1981, he tried to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs. He stopped himself before completing the act. Paul woke up with a terrible headache and red marks on his face, but he did not report what happened to the police because he did not want anyone to know he was gay. When Paul asked Dennis what had happened, Dennis acted surprised and told him he should see a doctor. In March 1982, Dennis killed again. He met a 23-year-old man named John Howlett in a pub near Leicester Square. John was from High Wycombe. Dennis called him John the Guardsman. He lured John back to his flat with the promise of more drinks. They drank together and watched a film. John went into the front room and fell asleep in Dennis's bed. About an hour later, Dennis tried to wake him. When he could not, he sat on the edge of the bed drinking rum and staring at John. Then he decided to kill him. When Dennis started to strangle John, John woke up and fought back hard. He even tried to strangle Dennis. Dennis had never struggled so much with a victim before. He thought he might lose the fight, but eventually he strangled John until he was unconscious using a strap from some furniture. Dennis went back to his living room, shaking from the stress of the struggle. Over the next 10 minutes, he noticed that John had started breathing again 3 times. Each time, he tried to kill him again. Finally, he filled his bathtub with water and drowned John. For more than a week afterward, Dennis's own neck still showed the marks from John's fingers where he had tried to fight back. In May 1982, Dennis met a 21-year-old gay man named Carl Stado at a pub in Camden. Carl was feeling sad because a relationship had just ended. Dennis bought him drinks and talked to him. He assured Carl that he did not want sex. He invited Carl back to his flat. At the flat, Carl drank more alcohol and fell asleep on an open sleeping bag. He woke up to find Dennis strangling him and whispering "Stay still" loudly. Carl later testified in court about what happened. He said he thought at first that Dennis was trying to free him from the sleeping bag zipper. Then he passed out. He vaguely remembered hearing water running, and then realized he was in water and Dennis was trying to drown him. He managed to lift his head above the water once and gasped, "No more, please, no more." But Dennis pushed his head back under the water. Dennis thought Carl was dead. He sat him in an armchair. Then he noticed that his dog, Bleep, was licking Carl's face. Dennis realized Carl was still barely alive. He rubbed Carl's arms and legs to help blood flow again. He covered him with blankets and laid him on the bed. When Carl woke up, Dennis hugged him. He told Carl that he had almost strangled himself on the sleeping bag zipper and that Dennis had saved his life. Over the next 2 days, Carl kept losing consciousness and waking up again. When he was strong enough to ask Dennis why he remembered being strangled and put in cold water, Dennis told him he had gotten caught in the sleeping bag zipper during a nightmare. He said he put Carl in cold water because he was in shock. Then Dennis walked Carl to a nearby train station, said he hoped they might meet again, and said goodbye. Carl did not report the attack to police at the time. In September 1982, Dennis killed again. He met a 27-year-old man named Graham Allen in Shaftesbury Avenue. Graham was trying to get a taxi. Dennis offered to take him home for a meal. Graham accepted. As with several other victims, Dennis said he could not remember the exact moment he strangled Graham. But he remembered walking up to him while Graham was sitting and eating an omelet that Dennis had cooked for him. He said he had the full intention of murdering him at that moment. Graham's body stayed in the bathtub for 3 days. Then Dennis began cutting it up on the kitchen floor. On October 9, 1982, Dennis called in sick to work so he could finish cutting up Graham's body. On January 26, 1983, Dennis killed his final victim. This was a 20-year-old man named Stephen Sinclair from Perth. Stephen was addicted to heroin and often hurt himself on purpose. Dennis met him on Oxford Street. He bought Stephen a hamburger first, then suggested they go back to his flat. At the flat, Stephen drank alcohol and injected heroin. He fell asleep in an armchair while Dennis sat listening to music from a rock opera. Dennis later described what happened next. He approached Stephen, knelt in front of him, and said to himself, "Oh Stephen, here I go again." He strangled Stephen with a rope and a necktie together. He noticed that Stephen had bandages on both wrists. He took the bandages off and saw deep cuts underneath where Stephen had tried to kill himself recently. Dennis followed his usual ritual. He washed Stephen's body. He put talcum powder on it. He arranged 3 mirrors around the bed and lay down naked next to the dead man. Several hours later, he turned Stephen's head toward him, kissed him on the forehead, and said, "Good night, Stephen." Then he fell asleep next to the body. Over the following days, Dennis cut up Stephen's body along with the bodies of John Howlett and Graham Allen. He wrapped the pieces in plastic bags. He put some bags in a wardrobe, some in a tea chest, and some in a drawer under the bathtub. He sealed the bags containing Stephen's remains with the same bandages he had taken from Stephen's wrists. To get rid of the flesh and smaller bones, Dennis flushed them down his toilet. He had done this before with some victims at Melrose Avenue. He also boiled the heads, hands, and feet of the 3 victims to remove the flesh from them. This made it easier to dispose of the remains. On February 4, 1983, Dennis wrote a letter to the company that managed his building. He complained that the drains at Cranley Gardens were blocked and that the situation was becoming impossible for him and the other tenants. The next day, he would not let someone into his flat because he was in the middle of cutting up Stephen Sinclair's body on the kitchen floor. On February 8, 1983, a worker from a plumbing company came to Cranley Gardens to look at the drains. Other tenants had also complained about blockages. The worker opened a drain cover at the side of the house at 6:15 in the evening. He saw that the drain was packed with a thick, flesh-like material and many small bones. He thought it looked strange and told his supervisor. Because it was getting dark, they decided to come back the next morning to look more closely. Before they left, Dennis and another tenant came out to talk about the blockage. When the worker said the material looked like human flesh, Dennis replied that it looked to Dennis like someone had been flushing their leftover fried chicken down the toilet. At 7:30 in the morning on February 9th, 1983, two plumbing workers named Michael Catran and Gary Wheeler returned to Cranley Gardens to investigate the blocked drains further. When they arrived, they found that the drain had been cleared overnight. This made them suspicious. Catran looked more closely and found some small pieces of flesh and 4 small bones in a pipe that connected to the drain from the top flat of the house. Both men thought the bones looked like they came from a human hand. They called the police immediately. Police officers came to the property and looked at what the plumbers had found. They took the bones and flesh to the mortuary at Hornsey. A pathologist named David Bowen examined the remains and told the police that they were human. He said one piece of flesh came from a human neck and had a mark on it that showed something had been tied tightly around it. The police spoke to the other tenants in the building. They learned that the top floor flat belonged to a man named Dennis Nilsson. A detective named Peter J. and 2 other officers decided to wait outside the house until Nilsson came home from work. When Nilsson arrived that evening, Detective J introduced himself and explained they were there about the blocked drains from his flat. Nilsson asked why the police were interested in his drains. He also asked if the 2 men with Jay were health inspectors. Jay told him they were also police officers and asked if they could go into his flat to talk further. The 3 officers followed Nilsson into his flat. As soon as they entered, they noticed a strong smell of rotting flesh. Nilsson again asked why the police were interested in his drains. Detective J told him that the blockage had been caused by human remains. Nilsson acted shocked and confused. He said, "Good grief, how awful." Detective J replied by saying, "Do not mess about. Where is the rest of the body?" Nilsson then became calm. He admitted that the rest of the body could be found in 2 plastic bags in a wardrobe nearby. The officers could smell a very strong smell of decay coming from that wardrobe. They did not open the cupboard, but asked Nilsson if there were any other body parts in the flat. Nilsson said it was a long story that went back a long time. He said he would tell them everything because he wanted to get it off his chest. He asked to do it at the police station, not at his flat. The officers arrested him on suspicion of murder and took him to Hornsey Police Station. On the way there in the police car, someone asked Nilsson if the remains in his flat belonged to 1 person or 2. Nilsson stared out the window and said 15 or 16 since 1978. That evening, Detective Chambers went with Detective J and the pathologist Bowen back to Cranley Gardens. They took the plastic bags from the wardrobe to the mortuary. In one bag, they found 2 cut-up upper bodies. One of these had been cut in half down the middle. There was also a shopping bag containing various internal organs. In the second bag, they found a human skull that had almost no flesh left on it, a severed head, and an upper body with the arms still attached but the hands missing. Both heads showed signs that they had been boiled. On February 10th, police interviewed Nilsson at the station. He told them there were more human remains in a tea chest in his living room and in a drawer under his bathtub. He explained that these were the bodies of 3 men he had killed at Cranley Gardens. He had killed them by strangling them, usually with a necktie. He could not name one of the victims. He knew another only as John the Guardsman. The third he identified as Stephen Sinclair. Nilsson also said that starting in December 1978, he had killed about 12 or 13 men at his old address on Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. He admitted that he had tried to kill about 7 other people. Some of them had escaped, and one had been brought back from the brink of death and allowed to leave. Later that same day, police searched Cranley Gardens again. They found the lower part of a body and 2 legs in a bag in the bathroom. In the tea chest in the living room, they found a skull, part of an upper body, and various bones. Nilsen also went with police to Melrose Avenue that day. He showed them 3 places in the back garden where he had burned the remains of his victims. The plumber Michael Catran contacted a newspaper called the Daily Mirror on February 10th. He told them about the ongoing search for human remains at Cranley Gardens. The newspaper published the story, and soon the whole country was paying attention to what was happening. Reporters from the Mirror went to Scotland and got photographs of Nilsen from his mother. These pictures appeared on the front page of the newspaper on February 12th. Under English law, the police had only 48 hours to either charge Nilsen with a crime or let him go. The pathologist Bowen laid out all the remains from Cranley Gardens on the floor of the mortuary. He was able to confirm that the fingerprints on one body matched police records for Stephen Sinclair. At 5:40 in the evening on February 11th, police formally charged Nilsen with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. They released a statement about this to the press. Formal questioning of Nilsen began that same evening. This time, Nilsen agreed to have a solicitor represent him. Over the following days, police interviewed him 16 separate times. The interviews totaled more than 30 hours. During these interviews, Nilsen told police he was not sure why he had killed. When they asked what his motive was, he said he was hoping they would tell him. He insisted that he did not decide to kill until just moments before doing it. Most victims died by strangulation. On several occasions, he drowned them after they were unconscious. After a victim was dead, he would usually bathe the body. He would shave hair from the body to make it look the way he wanted. He would put makeup on any marks on the skin. He would dress the body in socks and underwear. Then he would sit the body near him and talk to it. With most victims, he masturbated while standing over or kneeling next to the body. He admitted that he sometimes placed his penis between the legs of his victims' bodies, but he stressed that he never actually penetrated them. He said his victims were too perfect and beautiful for what he called the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. Nilsen explained that he destroyed all of his victims' personal belongings after killing them. He did this to remove their identity before they became what he called props in his fantasies. Sometimes he talked to the bodies while they sat in a chair or lay on his bed. He said he felt emotional when he looked at how beautiful their bodies were. He remembered that one victim, Kenneth Ockenden, had a body and skin so beautiful that it almost brought him to tears. Another victim he could not identify was so thin and weak-looking that he simply put him under the floorboards without any special ritual. At Melrose Avenue, Nilsen kept the bodies as long as he could before they decayed too much. When he noticed signs of decay, he put them under the floorboards. If a body was not decaying quickly, he would sometimes take it out from under the floorboards and look at it again. He would masturbate while standing over it or lying next to it. He would put more makeup on it to make it look better and hide any marks. Nilsen told police why he had boiled the heads found at Cranley Gardens. He said he often boiled the heads of his victims in a large pot on his stove. This made the inside of the heads evaporate, so he did not have to dispose of the brains and flesh separately. He cut up the bodies of the 3 Cranley Gardens victims within about a week of killing them. He wrapped the pieces in plastic bags and hid them where police had found them. The internal organs and smaller bones he flushed down the toilet. This was the only way he could think of to dispose of them, because he did not have a garden at Cranley Gardens like he did at Melrose Avenue. At Melrose Avenue, Nilsen kept bodies for much longer periods. He usually had 3 or 4 bodies under the floorboards at once. He would cut them up, wrap the pieces in plastic, and either put them back under the floorboards or place them in suitcases left by a previous tenant. The bodies in the suitcases were those of Kenneth Ockenden and Martin Duffy. He kept these suitcases in a shed in the garden until he burned them on his second bonfire. Other cut-up bodies went back under the floorboards or onto bonfires in the garden. Nilsen explained that he removed the accumulated bodies from under the floorboards 4 times. He cut them up on 3 of those occasions and burned them on bonfires. On more than one occasion, he took the internal organs out of the bodies, put them in bags, and dumped them behind a fence for animals to eat. All the bodies from Melrose Avenue were cut up after being under the floorboards for weeks or months. Nilsen said this was a very unpleasant task because the bodies were so decayed. He had to drink whiskey to give himself courage. He had to grab handfuls of salt to brush away maggots from the remains. He often vomited while cutting up the bodies, but just before he started cutting each one, he masturbated while kneeling or sitting next to it. He said this was his way of saying goodbye to his victims. When police asked Nilsen if he felt sorry for what he had done, he said he wished he could have stopped, but he could not. He said he had no other thrill or happiness in his life. He also said he did not enjoy the act of killing itself, but he worshipped the art and the act of death. On February 11, 1983, Nilsen was formally charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. He was taken to Brixton Prison to wait for his trial. While waiting, he complained about having to wear a prison uniform. He said he would refuse to wear any clothes at all to protest. Because of this threat, he was not allowed to leave his cell. On August 1st, he threw the contents of his chamber pot out of his cell and hit several prison officers. He was found guilty of assaulting the officers and spent 56 days in solitary confinement. On May 26th, a court decided that Nilsen would stand trial at the Old Bailey in London. He was charged with 5 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. A 6th murder charge was added later. Nilsen changed his legal representatives several times before the trial. At first, he wanted to plead guilty to all the murders. But 5 weeks before the trial, he hired a new solicitor who advised him to plead not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility. This means he would argue that he was not mentally responsible for his actions. Nilsen's trial began on October 24, 1983 at the Old Bailey. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The judge was Mr. Justice Croom Johnson. Nilsen pleaded not guilty to all charges. The main question for the court was not whether Nilsen had killed the victims. He had already admitted that. The question was whether he was sane and in control of his actions when he did it. The prosecutor, Alan Green, argued that Nilsen was sane. He said Nilsen was in full control of what he did and planned the murders in advance. The defense lawyer, Ivan Lawrence, argued that Nilsen suffered from diminished responsibility. He said Nilsen could not form the intention to commit murder and should only be found guilty of manslaughter. The prosecutor began by describing the events of February 1983. He told the court how human remains were found in the drains at Cranley Gardens, how Nilsen was arrested, and how 3 dismembered bodies were found in his flat. He talked about Nilsen's detailed confession and how he led police to the burned bone fragments of 12 more victims at Melrose Avenue. The prosecutor read part of an interview where Nilsen said that at the moment of the act of murder, he believed he was right in doing it. The prosecutor said that even if Nilsen had some mental abnormality, it was not enough to reduce his responsibility for the killings. The first witness to testify was a man named Douglas Stewart. He told the court that in November 1980, he fell asleep in a chair at Nilsen's flat. He woke up to find his ankles tied to the chair and Nilsen strangling him with a tie while pressing a knee to his chest. Stewart managed to fight Nilsen off. He said Nilsen then shouted, "Take my money," hoping other tenants would hear and think nothing was wrong. Stewart reported the attack to police at the time, but they dismissed it as a lover's quarrel. The defense lawyer tried to question Stewart's credibility by pointing out he had been drinking that night and had sold his story to newspapers. On October 25th, Two more survivors testified. A student named Paul Nobbs told the court that in November 1981, he went to Nilsen's flat for alcohol and sex. He woke up in the early morning with a terrible headache. When he looked in the bathroom mirror, his eyes were bloodshot and his face was completely red. Nilsen saw him and said he looked awful and should see a doctor. Nobbs did not report the attack because he was afraid people would find out he was gay. The prosecutor used this testimony to show that Nilsen had self-control and could choose not to kill. The defense lawyer argued it showed Nilsen could not control his impulses. Then Carl Stoddard took the stand. He told the court how Nilsen had tried to strangle and drown him in May 1982, then brought him back to life. His voice shook with emotion as he described pleading for his life while Nilsen held his head underwater. He described waking up to find Nilsen's dog licking his face. The judge had to stop several times to let Stoddard compose himself. Stoddard's experience was not part of the official charges because police did not know about him until after the charges were filed. Detective Inspector Peter J. then testified about Nilsen's arrest and his calm, matter-of-fact confessions. He read statements Nilsen had made, including one where Nilsen said he had no tears for his victims, for himself, or for those who lost loved ones because of his actions. Jay said it was unusual for someone accused of such terrible crimes to be so willing to provide information. He admitted that Nilsen had given most of the evidence against himself, and had even encouraged police to find evidence that might contradict his story. Another detective testified next. He read Nilsen's formal confession to the court. This included graphic descriptions of the rituals and sexual acts Nilsen performed with his victims' bodies. It described how he stored bodies and body parts, how he cut them up, and how he disposed of them. It also described the problems he had with bodies decomposing and with maggots. Several jurors looked shaken by what they heard. Others stared at Nilsen with disbelief. Nilsen himself listened without showing any emotion. This testimony continued into the next morning. The prosecutor then showed the court several items that had been found in Nilsen's flat. These included the cooking pot he used to boil the heads of his last 3 victims, the cutting board he used to cut up John Howlett, and several rusty knives that had belonged to the victim Martin Duffy. 2 psychiatrists testified for the defense. The first was James McKeith. He told the court that Nilsen had not developed emotionally and had trouble expressing any emotion except anger. He said Nilsen tended to treat other people as parts of his fantasies. McKeith explained that Nilsen connected unconscious bodies with sexual feelings. He said Nilsen had what he called an unspecified personality disorder that was severe enough to reduce his responsibility for his actions. The prosecutor questioned whether McKeith was truly sure of his conclusions, since he could not name a specific disorder. The second psychiatrist, Patrick Galway, diagnosed Nilsen with a severe personality disorder. He said Nilsen had episodes where he lost control and acted in sudden, violent ways. These episodes happened most often when Nilsen was isolated and lonely. Galway said Nilsen was not guilty of having planned the murders in advance. Under questioning from the prosecutor, Galway agreed that Nilsen knew what he was doing intellectually. But he stressed that because of his personality disorder, Nilsen did not truly understand that what he was doing was criminal. On October 31st, the prosecution called its own psychiatrist, Paul Bowden, to testify. Bowden had interviewed Nilsen 16 times for more than 14 hours before the trial. Over 2 days of testimony, Bowden said he found Nilsen to be unusual in a casual sense. But he concluded that Nilsen was a manipulative person who could form relationships but chose to treat people as objects. Bowden said he found no evidence of mental disorder and no evidence that Nilsen suffered from any problem that reduced his responsibility. After both sides finished their arguments, the jury left to consider their verdict on November 3, 1983. The next day they returned. They found Nilsen guilty of 6 counts of murder by a majority vote. They found him guilty of one attempted murder by majority vote and guilty of the attempted murder of Paul Nobbs by a unanimous vote. The judge sentenced Nilsen to life in prison. He recommended that Nilsen serve at least 25 years before being considered for release. After the trial, Nilsen was sent to Wormwood Scrubs prison to begin his sentence. As a high-risk prisoner, he had his own cell but could mix with other prisoners. He did not appeal his conviction. He accepted that the prosecution had been right when they argued that he could control his actions and that he planned his murders. He said on the day of his conviction that he got enormous pleasure from the social game of finding victims, bringing them home, deciding to kill, and then handling the bodies afterward. He also said that drunkenness was the only reason he failed to kill at least 2 of the people he attacked. In December 1983, another prisoner cut Nilsen on the face and chest with a razor blade. Nilsen needed 89 stitches to close his wounds. After this, he was moved to different prisons several times for his own safety. In December 1994, the Home Secretary Michael Howard changed Nilsen's sentence to a whole life tariff. This meant Nilsen would never be released from prison. Nilsen accepted this punishment and did not appeal it. In 2003, Nilsen was moved again to Full Sutton Prison in Yorkshire. There he spent his time translating books into Braille for blind people to read. He also read, wrote, painted, and composed music on a keyboard. He exchanged letters with many people who wanted to write to him. Over the years, he wrote a long autobiography called The History of a Drowning Boy. In this book, he wrote about living 2 separate lives his whole life. One life was real, and one was fantasy. He said he could switch between them instantly. He said that when he felt low and drank alcohol, he would seize opportunities to act out the sexual fantasies he had developed long ago. The fantasies always involved a young, attractive, passive partner and himself as the older, active partner. Acting them out gave him temporary relief from his feelings of inadequacy. In September 1992, a television company interviewed Nilsen for a program about criminal minds. The government tried to stop the interview from being broadcast, but a court ruled that it could be shown. Part of the interview aired in January 1993. Nilsen also brought several legal cases against the prison service over the years. He complained about prison rules and about magazines being censored before they reached him. Most of these cases were dismissed. In November 2006, police announced that they had identified Nilsen's first victim. He was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes from 1978. The identification was made using circumstantial evidence and by Nilsen identifying a photograph of the boy. Nilsen was not charged with this murder because prosecutors decided it would not serve the public interest and would not change his sentence. At least 4 victims killed between 1980 and 1981 remain unidentified to this day. A forensics expert testified at the trial that at least 8 bodies had been burned at Melrose Avenue, confirming Nilsen had killed at least 11 people. Several items from Nilsen's flat are on display at a police crime museum in London. These include the stove where he boiled the heads of his last 3 victims, the knives he used to cut up bodies, the headphones he used to strangle Kenneth Ockenden, the rope and tie he used on his last victim, and the bathtub from Cranley Gardens where he drowned John Howlett and kept Graham Allen's body. On May 10, 2018, Nilsen was taken from Full Sutton Prison to a hospital in York. He had severe stomach pains. Doctors found that a large blood vessel in his abdomen had burst. They performed surgery to repair it, but a blood clot formed afterward as a complication. Nilsen died on May 12, 2018. An examination after his death showed that the direct causes were a blood clot in his lung and bleeding behind his abdomen. In June 2018, Nilsen's body was cremated. Only 5 people attended the service. These were 3 prison officers and 1 person who had written letters to Nilsen in prison. No family members came. The prison paid more than £3,000 toward the cost of the funeral. Nilsen's ashes were later given to his family. In January 2021, a man who had exchanged more than 800 letters with Nilsen published an edited version of Nilsen's autobiography. The book is based on 6,000 pages of notes Nilsen wrote while in prison. It was published under the title The History of a Drowning Boy, the same title Nilsen had given his manuscript many years before.